Picture this, if you will. Joseph Stalin, the man of steel, surrounded by a bevy of beauties, a veritable harem hidden deep within the Kremlin's forbidding walls. Vodka flows like the Volga, Balalaikas strum mournful tunes, and clandestine passions ignite under the ever-watchful eyes of the NKVD. This is the stuff of lurid paperbacks and fevered imaginations, a potent cocktail of power, secrecy, and desire. It's an exotic, almost orientalist fantasy, painting the grim dictator as some sort of red sultan. But, dear reader, how much of this tantalizing image holds even a sliver of truth when confronted with the stark, grey reality of Soviet life under his iron fist? The contrast is, shall we say, rather dramatic. The Soviet Union, particularly during Stalin's zenith, was hardly a landscape conducive to such flamboyant displays of personal indulgence, at least not openly. It was a world of puritanical pronouncements, of five-year plans prioritized over personal pleasures, and of pervasive paranoia where even the slightest deviation from the party line could lead to a one-way trip to the Lubyanka, or worse. The official image of Stalin was that of a tireless leader, a father figure to his people, almost an ascetic devoted solely to the state. So, where does this vision of a Kremlin Casanova, complete with a collection of consorts, truly originate? It seems the more austere the public facade, the more outrageous the private speculation can become. Let us then, you and I, embark on a little historical detective work. Let's peer behind the thick velvet curtains of propaganda and myth that have shrouded Stalin's private life for so long. We are not looking for simple answers, for history, especially the history of such a complex and guarded figure, rarely offers those. Instead, we seek to understand the man behind the monolith, to sift through the whispers, the official records, and the often contradictory testimonies. What did love, affection, or even companionship truly mean to a man who wielded such absolute and terrifying power over millions of souls? The journey might surprise us, revealing a different kind of drama. The truth, as it often is, proves to be far more complex and, in many ways, more poignantly human than the sensationalist fictions. While the notion of a harem in the traditional sense is almost certainly a myth, a colorful distraction, Stalin's relationships with women were undeniably impactful, shaping him and perhaps even the course of Soviet events in subtle ways. These stories, both real and rumored, tell us much about the man, his times, and the enduring human fascination with the private lives of the powerful, especially those who cast such long dark shadows over history. So let's begin to unravel these threads, shall we? Before he became the remote and feared vojt, leader, the young Joseph Jughashvili, or Koba, as he was known in his revolutionary youth, experienced love in a way that seems almost unrecognizably tender compared to his later years. His first wife, Ekaterina Katosvanidze, a gentle Georgian beauty, was by all accounts a genuine, profound love. They married in 1906, and she bore him his first son, Yakov. Stalin, the hardened revolutionary, was reportedly devastated by Kato's untimely death from typhus just a year and a half later, in 1907. He famously told a friend at her funeral, "This creature softened my heart of stone." She died, and with her died my last warm feelings for humanity. This early, tragic loss undoubtedly left a deep scar. Some historians suggest that Kato's death contributed significantly to the hardening of Stalin's character, a chilling of the soul that would later manifest in unimaginable cruelty. It's a poignant thought, a personal tragedy, perhaps amplifying a pre-existing ruthlessness, pushing him further into the cold embrace of revolutionary zeal, where personal sentiment was a dangerous weakness. The warmth of that brief marriage stands in stark contrast to the emotional austerity that would later define his public and private persona. Imagine the what-ifs had she lived a fanciful notion, perhaps but one that underscores the human element even in such a monumental figure. During his numerous periods of Siberian exile, a common fate for revolutionaries under the Tsar Stalin wasn't entirely a monk. The isolation was immense, the conditions harsh, but human connections still formed, however fleeting or complicated. There are documented accounts of affairs. One notable liaison was with Lydia Pereprigina, his landlady's daughter, in the remote village of Kureika during his exile from 1914 to 1916. She was merely a teenager at the time, and this relationship resulted in the birth of a son, Alexander, though Stalin never formally acknowledged him. Such entanglements were not uncommon among exiles, a consequence of loneliness and proximity in desolate landscapes. These early relationships, particularly the one with Pereprigina and another with Maria Kuzakova, which also produced a son, Konstantin Kuzakov, whom Stalin did later show some slight, indirect favor, paint a picture of a man capable of forming attachments, however imperfect or exploitative they might seem by modern standards. These were not grand romances, but rather the messy human realities of a life lived on the fringes before power insulated and isolated him. They offer a glimpse of a different Stalin, one not yet entirely encased in the impenetrable armor of the supreme leader, a man whose personal life was still subject to the ordinary caprices of human desire and circumstance, albeit in extraordinary settings. Stalin's second wife, Nadezhda Nadia Alliluyeva, presents a far more complex and ultimately tragic chapter. She was the much younger daughter of Russian revolutionary Sergei Alliluyev, a friend of Stalin's from his early days. Nadia had known Stalin since she was a child, and he was a frequent visitor to her family's home. She grew up idolizing him as a heroic figure of the revolution. Their marriage in 1919, when she was just 18 and he was 40, was born out of this revolutionary fervor and youthful admiration, but it was destined for turmoil. She was intelligent, idealistic, and increasingly at odds with the brutal realities of her husband's burgeoning dictatorship and his often coarse, domineering personality. Life in the Kremlin for Nadia was far from a fairy tale. She worked for a time in Lenin's office and later enrolled as a student, seeking an existence beyond being merely Stalin's wife. She witnessed firsthand the harshness of Soviet policies, the purges, and the suffering of ordinary people, which deeply troubled her sensitive nature. Their marriage was reportedly stormy, marked by Stalin's public rudeness towards her, his infidelities, and fierce arguments over both political and personal matters. Nadia was not one to remain silent, and her criticisms, however privately expressed, must have been a source of irritation for a man increasingly intolerant of dissent, even from his own wife. The breaking point, or at least the most infamous public display of their discord, occurred at a Kremlin banquet in November 1932. Accounts vary, but it's said Stalin was boorish, perhaps flicking cigarette butts at her or making crude remarks. Nadia, humiliated and incensed, abruptly left the party. Later that night, she was found dead in her bedroom from a gunshot wound. Officially, her death was attributed to appendicitis, a blatant lie that fooled no one within the inner circle. The truth, that she had committed suicide, was a closely guarded secret, a profound personal and political embarrassment for Stalin. Her death was a devastating blow. Stalin's reaction to Nadia's suicide was reportedly a mixture of profound grief, rage, and perhaps guilt. Some say he felt betrayed by her act, seeing it as a personal attack. He famously did not attend her public funeral, though he did view her body privately. This event is often cited as a turning point, pushing him further into suspicion, isolation, and paranoia. The loss of Nadia, however fraught their relationship, removed one of the few people who might have dared to offer him a semblance of honest, critical feedback, however unwelcome. The Kremlin became an even colder, more fearful place in the wake of her tragic departure. After Nadezhda's death, Stalin never remarried. He was in his 50s, increasingly consumed by power, purges, and, well, a creeping paranoia. Did he then retreat into complete celibacy? Or did he find companionship, however fleeting or transactional, elsewhere? This is where the rumors of a harem, or at least of discreet affairs, truly begin to swirl with greater intensity. The most persistent stories involve women who were part of his immediate household staff, individuals who were constantly in his presence yet lived in the shadows, their lives entirely dependent on his whim. These were not glamorous courtesans, but ordinary women in extraordinary and often terrifying proximity to absolute power. One figure who looms large in these speculations is Valentina Valechka Istomina, his housekeeper for nearly 2 decades, from the 1930s until his death. She was loyal, discreet, and managed his dacha. Many memoirs from Kremlin insiders hint at a relationship that went beyond mere domestic service. Was she a lover, a confidant, or simply a comforting maternal presence in his increasingly isolated world? The truth is likely nuanced, perhaps a blend of all three. She certainly wielded a quiet influence, and he undoubtedly trusted her. Yet, to call this a romance in the conventional sense might be stretching the definition, given the immense power imbalance. Beyond Valechka, whispers abounded about typists, secretaries, and other female staff members who caught the leader's eye. Given the climate of fear and the absolute power Stalin wielded, it's plausible that some of these women might have been coerced or felt they had no choice but to comply with his advances, if any were made. It is equally plausible that some rumors were just that, gossip fueled by the intense, hermetically sealed environment of the Kremlin, where every glance and every word could be scrutinized and misinterpreted. The very secrecy that surrounded Stalin's life acted as a fertile breeding ground for such speculation. The less that was known, the more was imagined. Then there were the more glamorous, though far less substantiated, rumors involving famous actresses or ballerinas. Figures like the celebrated film star Lyubov Orlova were sometimes mentioned in hushed tones. However, concrete evidence for these liaisons is virtually non-existent. Such stories likely serve to add a touch of forbidden glamour to the grim Soviet narrative, or perhaps they were deliberately circulated to humanize or, conversely, to further mystify the dictator. In a world where information was tightly controlled, rumor became a powerful currency, reflecting anxieties, desires, and the sheer unknowability of what truly transpired behind those imposing Kremlin walls. These tales of dangerous women or secret trysts added another layer to the myth. So why, decades after his death, does the myth of Stalin's harem, or at least the intense curiosity about his love life, endure with such tenacity? Perhaps it's because we find it difficult to comprehend a figure of such immense destructive power as purely monstrous. We search for the human, for the relatable, even in the darkest of characters. Tales of love, lust, or even simple companionship can, paradoxically, make a dictator seem less alien, more a creature of flesh and blood, with recognizable desires and vulnerabilities. It's a way of trying to understand the incomprehensible, to find a chink in the armor of the totalitarian state. This fascination also speaks volumes about our collective relationship with power itself. There's an inherent allure to the secrets of the powerful, a voyeuristic desire to peek behind the curtain of statecraft and into the private chambers where, presumably, true selves are revealed. Scandals, real or imagined, involving sex and power have captivated humanity for centuries. They serve as morality tales, as titillation, or as a means of symbolically cutting down to size those who loom so large on the world stage. Speculating about Stalin's romantic entanglements allows us to engage with his legacy on a more personal, almost gossipy level, demystifying him while simultaneously adding to his mystique. The reality of Stalin's later private life, however, was likely far removed from any exotic fantasy. By all credible accounts, he became an increasingly isolated, suspicious, and lonely man, especially after Nadia's death and as the purges intensified. His evenings were often spent in marathon drinking sessions with his terrified inner circle, filled with forced camaraderie, crude jokes, and political maneuvering, rather than romantic dalliances. His world shrank to his dachas, his office, and the company of a few carefully vetted and thoroughly intimidated individuals. The image that emerges is less of a potentate with a harem, and more of a reclusive, work-obsessed tyrant haunted by his own ghosts. Ultimately, our enduring curiosity about Stalin's private world reflects a fundamental human need to make sense of history's most formidable figures. The whispers of affairs, the tragedy of his marriages, the rumored loneliness, these fragments help us construct a more rounded, albeit still incomplete picture. They remind us that even those who achieve godlike power remain, in some ways, profoundly human, subject to desires, losses, and the profound solitude that often accompanies the absolute control they so ruthlessly pursued. The Phantom Harem tells us less about Stalin and more about our own need to fill the silences of history with stories that resonate with our understanding of power and personality.